April 8, 1944. The Pacific night was blacker than ink, the sea an endless expanse of restless waves rolling beneath a canopy of stars. Off the coast of Luzon, a Japanese convoy churned westward, its freighters and escorts moving in nervous formation. Each ship strained to maintain the prescribed interval, every watchman peering into the void, their eyes burning from sleepless nights. The convoy commander believed he was safe. He believed the Imperial Navy's escorts, with their depth charges and sweeping searchlights, could shield the lifeline of supplies bound for the garrisons of the Philippines. But beneath those waves, invisible and patient, a pack of steel predators had already locked their sights on the unsuspecting prey. In the silence below, 200 feet under the surface, the crew of an American Gato-class submarine moved like a machine. Orders were whispered, gauges flickered in the dim red light, and the tension was suffocating. Sonar pings echoed from Japanese destroyers above, but the men of the submarine knew they were close enough to strike. The captain, a calm figure in the control room, stared at the plotting board where grease pencil lines intersected with the convoy's course. The mathematics of death had been calculated. At exactly 1:42 he gave the command. Tubes 1 through 4 fired in sequence, the hiss of compressed air, the lurch of the submarine's hull, and then silence. 30 seconds later, the sea erupted in sheets of fire. A freighter carrying aviation fuel detonated in a massive column of flame that split the sky. Japanese sailors screamed as burning oil cascaded across the surface, swallowing lifeboats and men alike. Another vessel struck amidships, folded in half before sinking into the abyss. Panic spread across the convoy. Escort destroyers raced in wild circles, dropping depth charges blindly into the darkness. The blasts shook the American submarine, rivets straining, lights flickering, but the captain ordered a hard turn. By the time the Japanese pounded the depths with their fury, the submarine had already slipped into the night, invisible once more. By dawn, 3 Japanese transports lay at the bottom of the South China Sea. Hundreds of men and thousands of tons of supplies vanished into the deep. Survivors clung to debris, staring at the horizon, unable to understand how their protection had failed so utterly. For centuries, Japanese fishermen and sailors had trusted the sea. They knew its tempers, its gifts, its dangers. Yet nothing in their traditions had prepared them for an enemy that could appear from nowhere, strike with precision, and vanish without a trace before the sun rose. To them it was as if ghosts haunted the water. In Tokyo, reports arrived with a cold regularity that unsettled even the most hardened naval officers. Convoys, carefully assembled and guarded, were being annihilated in a single night's work. Merchant captains muttered of unnatural American tactics, of uncanny detection devices, of submarines that struck with inhuman coordination. The Imperial Navy called it sabotage of the ocean. To fishermen who had lived generations by the tides, it seemed as though the Americans commanded the very darkness of the sea. The truth, however, was less mystical, but far more devastating. It was a calculated, technological war waged beneath the waves, a war the Japanese had never expected to fight. Every convoy loss carved another wound into Japan's fragile war machine. The nation's lifelines stretched across the Pacific, feeding armies in Burma, China, and the Philippines. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, bauxite from the islands, all of it depended on convoys navigating treacherous waters. Yet no matter how many ships Japan sent, American submarines were waiting. The Imperial Navy had built its doctrine on decisive battleships and swift carriers, but in the dark hours of 1944, it was the silent hunters beneath the sea that decided the fate of the empire. The men inside those steel tubes were far from invincible. Every dive threatened to crush the hull. Every depth charge rattled their bones and threatened to rip them apart. Oxygen grew stale during long submerged hours, yet they pressed forward. They were driven not only by orders, but by the knowledge that each torpedo loosed into the night carried the power to sever Japan's arteries of war. With every freighter sunk, the American submariners struck at the Empire's heartbeat. On that April night off Luzon, as dawn painted the wreckage in grim hues, the surviving Japanese sailors clung to makeshift rafts, watching the horizon. The convoy had left port full of hope, its decks stacked with crates and barrels destined for soldiers who were themselves starving and desperate. Now the sea was littered with floating rice sacks and shattered timbers. Men coughed seawater and oil, staring in disbelief. To them, the enemy was nowhere yet everywhere. By morning, rescue vessels would arrive, but the damage was done. Supplies would never reach their destination. Soldiers would go without food, tanks without fuel, aircraft without spare parts. American submarines had not only sunk ships, they had sown dread into every convoy that dared cross the Pacific. Word spread among Japanese merchant crews. Sailing meant gambling with death. Even hardened fishermen, once confident in their mastery of the waves, began to mutter about unnatural forces. Convoy after convoy vanished. The Pacific, once their familiar home, had turned into a graveyard. What the Japanese could not yet see was the precision and method behind the nightmare. Beneath the waves, American submarines were not acting randomly. They coordinated patrol zones, intercepted intelligence, and honed their torpedo tactics to perfection. They turned the ocean into a chessboard, with every freighter a pawn and every submarine a knight striking in the dark. Each engagement was a test of nerves, calculations, and engineering. Yet to the Japanese sailors above, it was as though the sea itself had turned traitor. Night after night, the pattern repeated. A convoy would set out, confident in its escorts. Somewhere in the black water, the sonar men on a destroyer might catch a fleeting sound, a distant echo. But before they could act, explosions would tear through the night. And by dawn, the convoy was scattered, ships burning, cargo lost, men gone. The ocean had swallowed them whole. For the United States, these victories were more than tactical. They were psychological. Submariners knew they were waging a war of attrition that cut deeper than any battlefield. Each success echoed in the minds of their enemies, forcing commanders to divert precious warships to convoy duty, stretching Japan's already fragile resources even thinner. And as the war dragged on, the fishermen, sailors, and soldiers of Japan grew accustomed to a grim truth. In the Pacific, there was no safety after nightfall. It was a campaign invisible to most of the world, yet decisive in shaping the war's end. And on that April night, as flames still burned across the waves and oil slicks drifted like shadows, the lesson was carved into the hearts of all who survived. American submarines could sink a convoy in a single night, and no amount of vigilance could stop them. By 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a brutal equilibrium. Japan's empire stretched like a vast web across Southeast Asia, binding together oil fields, rubber plantations, and mineral deposits that fueled its war machine. Yet beneath that web ran fragile arteries of transport, convoys of merchant ships carrying the lifeblood of the empire from the Indies to the factories and battlefronts of the north. Without those convoys, divisions in Burma would starve, pilots in the Philippines would run dry of aviation fuel, and the factories in Honshu would grind to a halt. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this, but their doctrine had been forged in another age. They dreamed of decisive battleship clashes and aircraft carrier duels. Convoy protection in their minds was a lesser task, almost beneath the prestige of an empire built on samurai tradition and naval grandeur. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States Navy had adopted a far different vision of war. It was not born from theory, but from necessity. In the early months after Pearl Harbor, American industry had been bloodied but not broken. Shipyards on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts erupted with activity. Factories retooled overnight. Submarines, long considered a secondary arm, suddenly became America's spear point in the Pacific. They would be the weapon that could strike deep, far behind enemy lines, and choke Japan's lifelines before the mighty battleships or carriers even drew near. The year 1942 was disastrous for American submariners. Their torpedoes, the Mark 14s, were plagued with flaws. They ran too deep. They failed to detonate, and sometimes they detonated prematurely, endangering the submarines themselves. Brave crews risked everything, only to watch their prey escape unscathed. Yet by 1943, the tide began to turn. Engineers corrected the defects. Tactics evolved, and commanders grew bolder, pressing closer to Japanese shores, testing convoy routes and rewriting the very doctrine of undersea warfare. For Japan, the nightmare grew quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. A ship vanished here, another there. Reports trickled in from scattered seas. But by mid-1943, the pattern sharpened. Convoys bound for Rabaul, Saipan, and the Philippines were being mauled. Not by surface raiders, not by aircraft, but by unseen hunters lurking beneath the waves. Japanese admirals were confounded. Their destroyers dropped depth charges until their holds ran empty, but the submarines slipped away. Merchant captains spoke of torpedoes coming from nowhere, striking with uncanny precision, then silence. It was as if the Americans had found a way to turn the ocean itself into a weapon. The Japanese naval tradition emphasized boldness, aggression, and decisive blows. Their submarines had been built for scouting and fleet actions, not commerce raiding. The idea of strangling an enemy through economic warfare was alien, almost dishonorable in their doctrine. They underestimated how lethal such a strategy could be when wielded with precision. For the United States, by contrast, this was not dishonor, it was necessity. With limited surface strength in the Pacific's early years, the submarine fleet became the lone dagger that could strike deep into the empire's heart. By 1944, the scale of destruction was undeniable. Japan depended on some 6 million tons of merchant shipping to sustain its war effort. American submarines, which made up barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, were destroying those lifelines at a pace the empire could not replace. The fishermen of Kyushu, accustomed to seeing convoys steam past in steady processions, began to notice fewer ships returning. Stories spread of entire fleets that left port and never arrived at their destination. The convoys themselves reflected the desperation. Some were escorted by old destroyers, many converted from obsolete designs. Their sonar equipment was primitive, their crews undertrained. Fuel shortages meant escorts could not always accompany their charges for the full journey. Japanese commanders often packed too many ships into tight formations, thinking concentration meant safety. In truth, it only offered American captains more targets at once. The broader strategic picture revealed the looming catastrophe. Japan had seized the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia with breathtaking speed in 1941 and 1942. But conquest was only half the battle. Those resources had to move north, across waters that grew more hostile by the month. American codebreakers, working tirelessly in hidden rooms from Pearl Harbor to Washington, intercepted Japanese radio traffic. They learned convoy routes, timings, even cargo manifests. Submarine commanders sailed with knowledge that turned the ocean into a hunting ground, mapped in advance. Still, the war under the sea was not without peril for the hunters. Depth charges rained down with terrifying violence. Hull plates groaned and shuddered. Men clenched their teeth as rivets popped like gunshots, waiting to see if the steel around them would hold. Submarines were lost. 52 American boats never returned. But the loss was measured against the devastation inflicted. Over half of Japan's merchant fleet destroyed by submarines alone. In Tokyo, whispers of unease grew louder. Admiral Toyoda, facing mounting reports, admitted the empire was bleeding faster than it could heal. Yet little could be done. Japanese shipyards could not replace merchant losses as swiftly as American submarines created them. The empire was like a body with severed veins, bleeding into the ocean each night. The fishermen who once sailed with confidence now watched convoys vanish into the horizon with dread. They knew many would not return. Families waited in villages along the coast, their eyes fixed on the sea, but the silhouettes of freighters grew fewer, the harbors quieter. To them, the Americans were phantoms. To historians, they were simply men in steel tubes, applying ruthless strategy with technological precision. The stage was set for a campaign unlike any other in history, a silent war beneath the waves that would starve Japan's empire into submission. The battles that followed would not be fought with grand fleets on the surface, but with mathematics, torpedoes, and the patience of men who stalked their prey in the endless dark. And every sinking, every explosion, carried the same message. The Pacific no longer belonged to the rising sun. What the Japanese convoys could not see was the hidden advantage stalking them beneath the waves. To their eyes, it seemed a mystery of fate. Why American submarines struck with uncanny accuracy, why torpedoes arrived from impossible angles, why escape seemed futile. But the truth lay in the cold precision of technology and the ruthless adaptation of doctrine. The United States Navy had turned its submarines into instruments of industrial war, not lone raiders of chance. At the heart of this transformation was communication. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, American submarines were not blind hunters acting in isolation. Each carried radios capable of sending and receiving encrypted orders. The U.S. Navy's intelligence services, powered by code-breaking units in Pearl Harbor and Washington, intercepted Japanese signals and plotted convoy movements with remarkable accuracy. This meant that when a submarine slipped into the Pacific, it was rarely wandering. It was hunting along a course already marked with likely prey. What looked to Japanese sailors like uncanny intuition was in truth the marriage of intelligence and coordination. The Japanese had relied on visual patrols and rigid schedules. Their doctrine assumed convoys could evade through secrecy, but American cryptographers had shattered that illusion. By the summer of 1943, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, was directing his boats like chess pieces across the vast ocean. Wolfpacks, a tactic borrowed and refined from German practice, allowed 2 or 3 submarines to converge on a single convoy. Where one submarine might harass an escort, another could slip behind and deliver the killing blow. Then came the torpedoes themselves. For nearly 2 years, American submariners had cursed the Mark 14 torpedo. It ran too deep, its magnetic exploder often failed, and dud hits left captains enraged as their targets sailed away. Crews risked their lives for nothing. But by 1943, after relentless pressure from the fleet, the defects were exposed and corrected. Depth settings were recalibrated. Contact exploders were redesigned. Suddenly, the same weapon that had been a source of shame became devastatingly reliable. Now when an American captain lined up his shot, he could fire with the confidence that his torpedoes would explode beneath the enemy's keel with lethal force. Japanese escorts, meanwhile, were crippled by technological shortcomings. Their sonar was primitive, with limited range and poor resolution. Their depth charges often exploded too shallow, unable to reach submarines that dove deep. Many captains lacked proper training in anti-submarine warfare, a discipline the Imperial Navy had never prioritized. Worse, Japan's industry could not produce enough escort vessels to protect every convoy. What few they had were spread thin, often forced to guard dozens of ships with only a handful of destroyers or converted trawlers. Against skilled submarine commanders armed with working torpedoes, it was a recipe for disaster. There was another hidden factor: American radar. By 1943, U.S. submarines were equipped with SJ surface search radar sets. In the black of night or the haze of dawn, these devices could detect convoys far beyond the reach of human eyesight. A Japanese convoy that believed itself concealed by darkness was already illuminated on the glowing screen inside a submarine's control room. Captains could shadow their prey through the night, maneuver unseen, and strike when the moment was perfect. To Japanese sailors, who saw nothing until the torpedoes hit, it seemed as though the Americans had eyes in the dark. Even the endurance of American submarines gave them an edge. The Gato and Balao-class boats were larger and more robust than most of their Japanese counterparts. They carried more torpedoes, more fuel, more provisions. A single patrol could last 2 months, covering thousands of miles, giving them the stamina to wait patiently along convoy routes. The Japanese subs designed for fleet scouting lacked that staying power. Where Japan's undersea fleet was an accessory, America's was a primary weapon of war. The results were catastrophic for the empire. In 1943 alone, American submarines sank over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping. But beyond the numbers was the growing sense of helplessness among Japanese crews. Merchant captains wrote of unseen attacks, torpedoes that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and escorts that could do little but drop depth charges at random. Fishermen in home waters, watching convoys disappear into the horizon, whispered that the Americans had found a way to control the very sea. From the American side, the advantage was hard-won but undeniable. Radar, reliable torpedoes, code-breaking, and coordinated tactics all fused into a single invisible weapon. The submarine force became a scalpel that sliced through Japan's supply lines with terrifying precision. And every convoy destroyed was more than ships lost. It was oil that would never fuel a Zero, rice that would never feed a soldier, steel that would never forge another weapon. The Japanese never fully understood how complete the American advantage was. Even as they tightened their convoy schedules, even as they deployed what few escorts remained, the losses mounted. By late 1944, The Empire's shipping was collapsing into ruin. To Japanese sailors, the explanation remained elusive. To American submariners, it was simple. Superior technology, superior intelligence, and the will to adapt had turned the tide beneath the waves. The ocean is a graveyard of machines, but every machine tells a story. And in the Pacific War, the story of America's submarine campaign was written in steel, copper, and innovation. To understand how Japanese convoys were shattered, one must descend into the very engineering of the weapons and vessels that made it possible. This was not only a war of men, it was a war of circuits, valves, engines, and alloys. The American submarine fleet, by 1943, was dominated by the Gato class and its successor, the Balao class. These were not small coastal raiders. Each was a leviathan of steel, 311 feet in length, with a displacement of over 1,500 tons submerged. They carried 24 torpedoes, loaded into 10 tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, giving them the ability to strike and then strike again. Their diesel-electric propulsion system, built around 4 General Motors or Fairbanks-Morse engines, allowed them to cruise at 20 knots on the surface and slip silently beneath the waves at 9 knots submerged. Yet their greatest strength was not just speed or endurance, it was range. With fuel tanks swollen to 94,000 gallons, a single patrol could stretch nearly 12,000 nautical miles. These boats were not bound to narrow hunting grounds. They could prowl from Pearl Harbor to the East China Sea, shadowing Japanese shipping lanes like wolves over a continent. Inside, the control rooms hummed with technology that gave the Americans their unseen edge. The SJ radar, introduced in 1942 and refined through 1943, transformed night operations. Operating at 10 centimeters wavelength, it could detect surface ships at ranges up to 8 miles, even in pitch darkness or blinding rain. To a Japanese convoy commander relying on lookouts straining their eyes against the black horizon, the Americans might as well have been supernatural. They could see without sight. Then there was sonar, known to submariners as sound gear. The QC sonar arrays fitted to U.S. boats allowed them to track the echoes of distant screws, to listen for escorts long before visual contact. Combined with radar, this gave the captain a complete tactical picture that his Japanese counterpart could never hope to achieve. But the most infamous weapon of all was the Mark 14 torpedo, and its story is one of both frustration and redemption. At 21 feet long and weighing over 3,000 pounds, the Mark 14 was designed to deliver a 643-pound warhead of high explosive, the largest carried by any submarine torpedo of the era. Fired at speeds of 46 knots, it could run over 4,000 yards, or at a reduced speed of 31 knots reach nearly 9,000 yards. On paper, it was devastating. In practice, it nearly crippled the submarine force in the early war. Faulty depth settings caused it to run 10 to 15 feet deeper than intended. Magnetic exploders, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, often fizzled or triggered prematurely. Contact pistols jammed on angled strikes, rendering hits useless. For 2 years, American captains risked their lives only to watch perfect ambushes fail. The fury was immense. One commander likened firing a Mark 14 to poking a bear with a stick and then apologizing for it. It took brutal, relentless field testing to fix the flaws. Captains conducted unauthorized experiments, firing live torpedoes at cliffs, reefs, even at derelict ships, recording the failures with grim precision. By mid-1943, the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer deny reality. Corrections were made, depth control mechanisms were recalibrated, magnetic exploders were deactivated, contact pistols were redesigned, and suddenly the torpedo became the weapon it was always meant to be. In the hands of determined crews, the Mark 14 turned convoys into tinderboxes. Japanese escorts were ill-equipped to counter. The Imperial Navy's primary anti-submarine sonar, the Type 93, was primitive, with a detection range often less than 2,000 yards under ideal conditions. Their depth charges, modeled on British designs from the 1920s, carried warheads of only 220 pounds, often set to detonate too shallow to reach American submarines diving deep. Worse, Japan had not invested in advanced radar until very late in the war. Convoys moved in darkness, thinking themselves invisible, while American captains tracked them with uncanny ease. The disparity extended beyond combat performance to industry itself. American factories like Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire churned out submarines in assembly line fashion. By 1945, over 200 fleet submarines patrolled the Pacific, each a technological marvel. Meanwhile, Japanese shipyards, already strained by shortages of steel and fuel, could not replace merchant or escort losses at the pace they were being destroyed. Even logistics aboard the submarines revealed the engineering edge. Air conditioning systems, absent on Japanese boats, allowed Americans to patrol in tropical seas without succumbing to heat stroke. Refrigeration preserved food for weeks, while Japanese crews often endured spoiled rations. The small comforts meant American sailors could endure longer, fight sharper, and return to sea with fewer casualties from disease or exhaustion. Every number told the same story. The Mark 14's 643-pound warhead compared to the Japanese Type 95 torpedoes' 893 pounds. But while the Japanese weapon was powerful, it was tied to a doctrine of attacking warships, not supply convoys. The American torpedoes, corrected and reliable, were unleashed against the true arteries of war: tankers, freighters, troop transports. One by one they vanished beneath the Pacific, from the steel of the Ballo's pressure hull, capable of diving to 400 feet, to the 25,000-watt transmitters that carried intelligence back to Pearl Harbor. The technical depth of the submarine force represented an industrial colossus at work. Japan had built weapons of elegance and power, the Zero fighter, the Yamato battleship. But the United States had built weapons of endurance and coordination. And in the Pacific, that difference was decisive. Thus, when Japanese fishermen watched convoys vanish overnight, it was not superstition that doomed their ships. It was engineering. It was the whisper of vacuum tubes in radar sets, the click of relays in sonar gear, the grinding hum of electric motors driving a steel predator into firing position. It was a war fought not only by men, but by machines designed to bend the ocean to their will. September 19, 1944. The Lorraine plain of northeastern France burned with autumn sunlight, but half a world away in the South China Sea, another kind of fire was about to ignite. Convoy HI-72, a column of oil tankers, freighters, and troop transports, plowed its way north from Singapore toward Japan. 33 ships in total, their holds stuffed with rubber, tin, and petroleum, the very essence of Japan's war machine. They were guarded by 7 escorts, destroyers, Kaiboken frigates, and patrol craft. To the Japanese commander, the convoy seemed formidable, a moving fortress of steel. But beneath the waves, 3 American submarines lay in wait, each crew straining in silence for the moment to strike. The USS Growler, USS Pampanito, and USS Celian had formed a wolf pack, guided by the meticulous hand of Admiral Lockwood and intelligence from codebreakers who had pierced Japanese communications. They knew HI-72's route, its speed, even its departure time. To the American captains, this was not chance. It was choreography, a deadly dance in which the convoy moved to their rhythm. At 2200 hours, radar screens aboard the submarines flickered alive. Blips appeared, first one, then many. The convoy had entered the killing ground. The American boats spread out like hunters circling a herd. The escorts swept their searchlights, but the night was vast, and the submarines were shadows beneath the surface. At precisely 2300, Growler fired her first spread of torpedoes. White streaks carved through the black water. Moments later, the sea erupted. A massive transport carrying Japanese soldiers was ripped apart, flames shooting skyward, as men screamed in the darkness. Celian followed, firing into a tanker laden with crude oil. The explosion shook the heavens, black smoke rolling across the starlit sky like a funeral shroud. Pampanito, attacking from the rear, slipped her torpedoes beneath another freighter. Within minutes, the convoy dissolved into chaos. Japanese escorts lunged wildly, depth charges exploding with bone-rattling fury. Inside Growler, men clutched bulkheads as the submarine shook violently. Light bulbs burst, gauges trembled, the air thick with the acrid tang of battery fumes. Yet the captain held his nerve, diving deeper, twisting away. Sonar pings rang out like hammers on a coffin lid, but the depth charges fell wide. Above, the convoy was disintegrating. Ships collided in panic, some ramming each other in the darkness. Fires leapt from burning decks onto neighboring vessels. Sailors abandoned ship only to drown in seas slick with oil. Within hours, 11 ships had been struck. 6 vanished beneath the waves. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and passengers perished. Yet amid the carnage, one scene would sear itself into memory. Pampanito, surfacing the next morning, found hundreds of survivors clinging to debris. They were men of the Imperial Japanese Army, gaunt, terrified, their uniforms soaked in oil. Many were already dying. Pampanito's crew debated rescue. Then they realized something astonishing. Among the wreckage were Allied prisoners of war, Australians and British who had been transported in secret aboard the sunken transports. The Americans hauled them aboard, saving dozens from certain death. The grim irony was unmistakable. Japan's own convoy had carried the very men its empire had enslaved, only to see them freed by the destruction wrought that night. The Japanese survivors left behind could only stare at the horizon, bewildered. How had their escorts failed? How had 3 submarines scattered a convoy of 33 ships in a single night? Rumors spread of American submarines that fired without missing, that evaded depth charges with supernatural skill, that seemed to know convoy routes before the ships even sailed. To those clinging to wreckage, it was as though the ocean itself had betrayed them. For the U.S. Navy, the sinking of HI-72 was more than another victory. It was proof of doctrine, of intelligence, of technology, honed to a razor's edge. It demonstrated the fusion of radar detection, wolfpack tactics, and corrected torpedoes. Each factor played its part, and the results were undeniable. Japan's lifelines could not survive against such hunters. Other battles echoed the same theme. Convoy High 81, November 1944, was mauled by the USS Spadefish. Convoy High 87, struck near Formosa, lost tankers vital to fueling the Navy's dwindling carriers. Again and again, American submarines appeared, fired, and vanished. To the Japanese, it seemed a curse. To historians, it was the culmination of strategy. Every detail from those engagements reveals the imbalance. Where Japan sent convoys without air cover, the Americans stalked unseen. Where escorts lacked fuel to maintain constant patrols, submarines slipped through gaps. Where radar was absent, American captains plotted intercepts in darkness. Losses mounted. Between late 1943 and the end of 1944, Japan lost nearly half its merchant fleet. Without oil, the great battleships Yamato and Musashi lay idle. Without supplies, garrisons from New Guinea to Burma starved. On the decks of fishing villages across Japan, families listened to rumors whispered by survivors. Convoys had been sunk in a single night, entire cargoes devoured by the sea. Fishermen, once masters of coastal waters, began to view the Pacific with dread. They believed the Americans had built machines that commanded the darkness. And in a sense they had. The battle for HI-72 was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint repeated again and again. Submarines lurking along convoy routes, torpedoes striking with precision, escorts flailing in vain. Survivors clinging to wreckage at dawn, wondering how the sea could be so cruel. For the men in the conning towers of American submarines, it was not cruelty, it was duty. And each sunken ship carried Japan one step closer to collapse. War is not only measured in ships sunk or tonnage lost, it is measured in fear, in morale, in the silent erosion of hope. By late 1944, the Japanese merchant marine was no longer just losing ships, it was losing faith. Every convoy that vanished into the Pacific without return sent tremors through the empire. The strategic and psychological impact of America's submarine campaign was profound, reshaping not only the course of the war, but the very spirit of those who sailed upon the sea. At the strategic level, the results were merciless. Japan's empire had been built on a gamble, that its conquests of 1941 and 1942 would yield oil, rubber, rice, and minerals in such abundance that the war could be sustained indefinitely. But conquest was only half the battle. These resources needed to be carried home, across seas that grew more hostile with each passing month. By 1944, American submarines had become the scythe that cut down those lifelines. Nearly half of all Japanese merchant shipping lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Entire fleets of tankers were gone, their crude oil never reaching the refineries of Honshu. Rice shipments rotted in the hold of sunken freighters, leaving garrisons to starve. Armored divisions found themselves immobilized, not by enemy fire but by empty fuel drums. The collapse rippled outward. Without oil, the Imperial Navy's carriers could no longer sortie for decisive battles. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sat impotent in harbor, its massive guns silent for lack of fuel to move it. Aircraft production slowed as bauxite shipments dwindled. Even civilian life withered. In Tokyo, ration lines stretched for blocks. Families survived on meager portions of barley and sweet potatoes. Children grew up gaunt, their fathers gone at sea, their mothers haunted by the thought of convoys that had never returned. Yet beyond the strategic toll lay the crushing weight of psychology. Japanese sailors, both military and civilian, began to view the ocean not as a road of life but as a graveyard. Convoy duty became a sentence of dread. Merchant captains spoke in hushed tones of American submarines that could appear from nowhere. Some said they carried devices that let them see through the dark. Others whispered of cursed waters where no ship could pass unharmed. Superstition mingled with truth, for how else could they explain losses so relentless? The escorts, too, were demoralized. Destroyer crews fired depth charges until their arms ached, listening to explosions reverberate through the deep, only to find nothing. Hours of tension left them drained, nerves frayed, every sonar ping a hammer blow to the mind. When survivors were plucked from oil-stained seas, their stories only deepened the fear. They spoke of torpedoes slamming into hulls with inhuman precision, of submarines that slipped away as though the ocean itself shielded them. On the American side, the impact was the reverse. Submariners, once frustrated by faulty torpedoes, now sailed with grim confidence. They knew that every patrol would bring success. They felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also the exhilaration of striking at the very core of Japan's war effort. Morale soared as each victory was tallied. Crews returned to Pearl Harbor, greeted not just with cheers, but with the knowledge that they had changed the war's trajectory. The contrast between the two sides could not have been sharper. American submariners felt connected to their commanders, to intelligence officers decoding enemy signals, to the broader war effort that celebrated their successes. Japanese merchant sailors felt isolated. Radio silence kept them blind. Escorts that failed to protect only deepened their despair. Each torpedo was not just an explosion of steel and fire. It was a blow to their spirit, convincing them that resistance was futile. The psychological effect spread even to the home islands. Fishermen returning from sea told of convoys that had been annihilated. Families gathered at ports, waiting for ships that would never dock. Rumors spread faster than official reports. The ocean, once a source of livelihood and pride, became a symbol of danger. To a nation that revered its maritime tradition, the sense of betrayal by the sea itself was devastating. Strategically, the collapse of Japan's shipping sealed its fate. Armies stranded in China, Burma, and the Pacific Islands fought on, but they were starving shadows of their former strength. Aircraft sat idle without fuel. Factories went silent without raw materials. Japan was not simply losing battles, it was being hollowed out from within. The empire was dying not in one great clash of fleets, but in 1,000 silent sinkings beneath the waves. Psychologically, the campaign broke the will of those who endured it. Japanese officers recorded the despair of their men. One convoy commander admitted in his diary, "We sail knowing death waits and we cannot stop it." That sense of inevitability, of helplessness, was perhaps the most powerful weapon the Americans wielded. War is not just fought with guns and torpedoes, it is fought in the mind. And in the minds of Japan's sailors, the battle was already lost. By 1945, the effect was undeniable. Japan's merchant fleet, once 6 million tons strong, had been reduced to less than 2 million. The empire could no longer feed itself, fuel its ships, or sustain its armies. The strategic chokehold and the psychological collapse marched in lockstep, dragging Japan toward surrender. And for those Japanese fishermen who watched convoys leave port under cover of night, only to vanish without a trace, the war's most haunting truth remained. The Americans had turned the ocean into a weapon, and it was a weapon no sailor could escape. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Japan stood broken, its empire reduced to ashes, its people starving, its fleets rusting in shattered harbors. But in the story of that collapse, one thread runs darker and deeper than most. The silent war beneath the waves, where American submarines strangled an empire without ever firing a battleship's broadside. The legacy of that campaign would echo far beyond the Pacific, shaping not just the memory of World War II, but the very blueprint of modern warfare. The numbers themselves were staggering. 52 American submarines were lost in the Pacific, over 3,500 men entombed forever beneath the sea. But their sacrifice wrought devastation unparalleled in naval history. Of the 6 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping that existed at the start of the war, more than 4 million were sent to the bottom. Tankers that once carried the lifeblood of oil from the Dutch East Indies lay twisted in coral graves. Transports that ferried rice, steel, and soldiers to far-flung garrisons now fed only fish. By war's end, Japan's shipping was reduced to a fraction of its former strength, barely enough to move food between its home islands. For American submariners, the achievement was grim, but undeniable. Barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel had inflicted over half of Japan's total shipping losses. They had been the dagger at the empire's throat, wielded with quiet precision, night after night, patrol after patrol. Historians would later call it one of the most effective naval blockades in history, achieved not by surface fleets, but by invisible hunters beneath the waves. The lessons were not lost on those who studied the war. In the early years of the Cold War, strategists recognized that control of the sea lanes was not only about mighty fleets, it was about denying the enemy the ability to move resources at all. Submarines became the centerpiece of naval strategy, their roles expanding from commerce raiding to nuclear deterrence. The ghosts of the Pacific campaign lingered in every decision, from the design of ballistic missile submarines to the emphasis on sonar, radar, and stealth. In Korea, in Vietnam, and later in the Persian Gulf, the shadow of World War II's submarine war remained. Convoy systems, once dismissed by Japan as tedious, became standard doctrine for every nation that valued its shipping. Radar and sonar evolved into complex webs of electronic warfare. And above all, the principle was etched into military thought. In modern war, it is not enough to field powerful armies or mighty fleets. One must also protect the arteries of supply. Without them, no empire, no matter how vast, can endure. For Japan, the memory was searing. Families along its coasts remembered convoys that left in proud formation and never returned. Fishermen spoke of nights when the horizon glowed with fire, when the sea carried wreckage and bodies back to their shores. The war taught them that the ocean, once a source of life, could become an implacable enemy when wielded by a foe who understood its depths. The psychological scar lingered for generations. Even after Japan rebuilt into a peaceful economic power, the stories of vanished convoys haunted its coastal towns. Survivors remembered clinging to rafts, watching the shadows of submarines pass beneath them like steel sharks. They remembered the helplessness of seeing escorts circle blindly, while torpedoes found their marks again and again. For them, the Americans had turned invisibility into a weapon, and that memory never faded. Yet out of the wreckage, a strange respect endured. Japanese officers later admitted that America's submarine campaign had been decisive, more so than many of the grand battles fought with carriers and battleships. Field Marshal Keitel, reflecting on Germany's own war at sea, once remarked, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same could be said of submarines. Japan built mighty warships, elegant and powerful, but America built submarines that worked as a system, guided by intelligence, armed with corrected torpedoes, connected by radios and radar, deployed in coordinated wolf packs. It was not brute force that sank Japan's convoys. It was connection, speed, and precision. The legacy for America was pride, tempered by sorrow. Pride in the efficiency of the campaign, in the sailors who endured weeks in steel coffins to deliver crushing blows. Sorrow for the 52 boats that never returned, for the men entombed in silence, their patrol logs ending mid-sentence. Monuments across the United States still bear their names, reminders that victory came at a terrible cost. And for the world, the lesson was immortal. War is not decided solely by the clash of armies on battlefields or fleets in open water. It is decided in the unseen struggles, the convoys that arrive or vanish, the resources that fuel the guns or run dry. In the Pacific, American submarines proved that connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor. On quiet nights, the Pacific still whispers of that war. Fishermen cast their nets where convoys once burned. Divers explore wrecks that sleep in the dark. cargo holds still heavy with the rusting bones of an empire. And the submariners, who once slipped through those waters unseen, remain eternal phantoms of the deep, proof that in modern war, the greatest victories are often won in silence. The Americans had not conjured ghosts. They had built machines, wielded with intelligence, patience, and iron will. But to the men who watched their convoys vanish overnight, it mattered little. To them, the sea itself had betrayed Japan, and that betrayal, more than any bomb or bullet, ended the empire's dream.